They stumbled into the cowboy's camp half alive and forced him to break every rule he ever made. Jace had always lived by a strict set of rules. The world was vast and unforgiving, and out here in the harsh desert there was no room for anything but survival. He had his camp, his fire, and his solitude. That's all he needed. He didn't ask for company, and he didn't care about anyone else. The fewer people around, the better. It had always been that way. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, casting a dark shadow over the rocky landscape. A chill had begun to creep through the air, but Jace wasn't worried. He'd been through enough cold nights to know it wouldn't last long. His fire burned brightly, a small comfort in the middle of nowhere. The crackling of the flames was the only sound as he sat next to it, staring into the dancing embers. He was in the middle of nowhere. No town, no roads, just desert stretching in every direction. This was his place. No one came here. No one ever would. That was until the rustling came. At first, Jace thought it was the wind. But the sound was too steady, too deliberate. Someone, or something, was moving through the brush. His hand instinctively went to the rifle at his side. He'd been in situations before where a stray animal or a band of troublemakers had decided to pay him a visit. He wasn't about to let it happen again. Quietly, he rose to his feet, moving like a shadow through the dark, his boots barely making a sound against the dirt. He crouched behind a rock, keeping his eyes on the movement ahead. Whoever, or whatever, it was getting closer. Then the figures appeared, 2 people, stumbling through the dark, their bodies bent low as if they were fighting for every step. They were injured, their clothes torn and stained with blood. One was a man, the other a woman. Both were young, but they looked like they'd been through hell. The man was barely holding himself up, leaning on the woman for support. The woman's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Jace's first instinct was to turn away, to ignore them and keep to his camp. But something in the woman's eyes stopped him. There was something desperate there, something raw. She wasn't just lost, she was begging for help. "Help us," she called weakly. Her voice cracked, but the words were clear. "Please." Jace hesitated. He wasn't the kind of man who got involved. He never had been. He'd made a rule long ago: never trust strangers. Never let anyone into your camp. The fewer people you had to deal with, the safer you were. It was simple, it was clear, and it worked. But there was something about her, something that made Jace's heart tighten. He couldn't explain it, but he knew he couldn't turn his back on them. Not now. He stepped forward slowly, keeping his rifle close. His eyes never left the pair. "What happened?" Jace's voice was low, guarded. The woman gasped for breath. "They're after us. We've been running for days." Her words were punctuated by deep, shaky breaths. The man beside her was too far gone to speak. He leaned heavily on her, and Jace could see his eyes were barely open. The man wouldn't last much longer. Jace's grip on his rifle tightened. "Who's after you?" She looked at him, her face pale with fear. "Raiders?" she whispered, voice trembling. "They're looking for something. We don't know what it is, but it's big. We barely escaped, but they'll be here soon." The words hit Jace like a stone. Raiders weren't uncommon in these parts, but they didn't usually target people without a reason. And a search for something? That was new. Jace didn't like the sound of it, but the woman's voice, her fear, it was real. She wasn't lying. Jace thought about turning them away. He thought about sending them off into the desert, telling them to find their own way. He'd done it before. But this time something made him hesitate. "Where are you headed?" Jace asked, his tone hardening. He wasn't sure why he was even asking. But he had to know. She glanced toward the horizon, as if the answer was too far to reach. "We were heading to the nearest settlement, but we can't make it."
"We need help." Jace's eyes narrowed.
The nearest settlement was days away, and no one there would care about a pair of strangers running from raiders. Not unless they had something worth saving. But Jace didn't need to know that just yet. He exhaled sharply, eyes flicking toward the horizon.
"You the rules." He lived by them for years.
But every time he thought about turning them away, something gnawed at him, something he couldn't ignore. Without another word, Jace grabbed the man and helped him to the ground by the fire. The woman collapsed beside him, too tired and too weak to do much else. Jace didn't say anything as he set to work, cleaning their wounds, bandaging them as best as he could. His mind raced. What had they seen? What were they running from? And why were the raiders after them? The answers would come soon enough, but for now all Jace could do was get them through the night. As the fire flickered, he kept his eyes on the horizon. He knew he was breaking his own rule. He was getting involved, and that was something he hadn't done in a long, long time. But he couldn't turn away. "Thank you," the woman said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She met his gaze, her eyes full of gratitude, and something else, something deeper. Jace didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. He wasn't in the habit of talking much. His silence was enough. As the night stretched on, the stars overhead seemed to watch them from a distance. The world was silent, as if holding its breath. And Jace? He was left wondering if helping these strangers would be the one mistake he'd regret, or the one decision that would change everything. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows across the camp. Jace kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, watching the faint glow of the desert in the distance. The wind was still, as if waiting for something to happen. The two strangers lay beside the fire, their breathing slow but steady as they regained their strength. The woman, Alara, had fallen asleep, her face pale under the stars. Kai, the man, still seemed unconscious, but at least he was no longer bleeding. Jace wasn't one to give much thought to people. Strangers were dangerous, and he had always kept his distance. But there was something about these two. Something in the way they had arrived at his camp. Half dead, desperate, and terrified. They had been running from something. Jace sat back on his heels, staring into the fire. His mind raced with questions. Who were they really? And why were the raiders after them? Alara and Kai had been vague, speaking only enough to convince him to help them, but they hadn't told him everything, not by a long shot. There was more to their story, and Jace wasn't going to let it go. As the fire popped and crackled, Jace stood up, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. The night was cold, the stars like diamonds scattered across the sky. He moved toward the edge of the camp where the shadows were deepest. His instincts were on high alert. Something didn't feel right, and he couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was closing in. Just as Jace was about to turn back to check on them, a voice spoke from the darkness. "You're not asking the right questions." It was Alara, her voice barely audible, as if she had just woken up. He didn't answer immediately, but took a slow step toward her, his eyes scanning the night. He didn't want to seem too eager, but the tension in her voice told him she was holding back. Jace finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "You've been running from something. What is it?" Alara shifted slightly on the ground, trying to sit up. She winced from the pain, but forced herself to meet his gaze. "The raiders aren't just random bandits. They're searching for something. Something important." Jace crossed his arms, leaning against a nearby rock. "And what is it?" She hesitated. Her eyes darted toward Kai, who remained unconscious. Jace followed her gaze, but didn't press her further. Whatever this was, it was bigger than just a couple of people on the run. "We don't know everything," Alara continued, her voice growing softer, "but we've seen enough to know they'll stop at nothing to get what they want." He had dealt with raiders before. They weren't anything new, but something about her words struck him. The fear in her voice was real. Whatever the raiders were after, it wasn't just money, it was something bigger. "Why are they after you?" Jace asked, the question hanging in the air. Alara looked down at the ground, her hands trembling. "We were part of a mining operation digging below the surface. We found something the raiders want." Jace's heart skipped a beat. A mining operation beneath the surface. That was no ordinary find. "What did you find?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. Alara's eyes flicked back to him, her face hardening. "I can't tell you that, not yet. But I can tell you this, whatever they're looking for, it's not just treasure. It's something dangerous." Jace's brow furrowed. Dangerous? That didn't sound like something a miner would stumble upon. And the raiders, what could they possibly want with something dangerous? He paced back and forth for a moment, his thoughts racing. This wasn't adding up. But something told him that if he didn't press them for answers, they'd keep him in the dark, and in his line of work, that was never a good place to be. Finally, he turned back to her. "You're going to have to trust me. If we're going to make it out of this, I need to know everything. What did you find? What's so dangerous about it?" Alara bit her lip, her gaze shifting away from him. She clearly didn't want to say it, but Jace could see the weight of her words in her eyes. She knew this wasn't just about surviving another night in the desert. "It's a weapon," she said softly. "A weapon buried beneath the surface, something ancient. And if the raiders get their hands on it, they could change everything." Jace stopped in his tracks, the words hanging heavy in the air. "A weapon?" The raiders weren't just looking for gold or supplies. They were hunting something far more dangerous. He took a deep breath, his mind working through the possibilities. This was bigger than anything he had ever encountered. He wasn't sure if Alara and Kai understood just how much danger they were in, or if they even knew the full extent of it themselves. But one thing was clear: the stakes were higher than he had thought. The wind picked up, howling through the desert. Jace looked over at Kai again, who still hadn't moved. He was breathing, but barely. It wouldn't be long before the man woke up, and when he did, Jace wasn't sure what he would say. But if Alara was telling the truth, the raiders weren't going to give up easily. They were after something that could change the balance of power on this planet, and the very thought of it made Jace's stomach twist. "You're sure about this?" Jace asked, still needing confirmation. Alara nodded, her face grim. "I wish I wasn't, but it's true. We barely escaped, and I don't know how much longer we can keep running. The raiders, they have no mercy. They'll do anything to get their hands on that weapon." Jace looked out at the desert once more, his thoughts swirling. The rules he had lived by, rules that had kept him alive all these years, were starting to crumble. He had always believed in staying out of things and keeping his head down, but now he was tangled in something far bigger than he could have imagined. And the more he heard, the more he realized that his involvement had become unavoidable. He wasn't just protecting his own life anymore. The future of this entire planet might depend on the choices he made in the next few days. With a deep sigh, Jace made up his mind. There would be no more turning away. If what Alara said was true, he was already part of this fight whether he liked it or not. "We'll go to the settlement," Jace said firmly. "But you need to tell me everything you know. No more secrets." Alara nodded, her face filled with a mixture of relief and fear. She knew the danger wasn't over yet, but at least for now, they had a chance. Jace stood up, looking toward the horizon once more. The night had settled into a heavy silence, and in that silence, Jace knew one thing for sure. Nothing would ever be the same. The desert stretched out before them, endless and unforgiving. Jace kept his eyes on the horizon, where the faint outline of the mining settlement could be seen, a small speck in the vast emptiness. The night had passed quietly, the fire now just a pile of glowing embers. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of dust and dry earth. Jace stood up, his body stiff from the cold and the hours spent in thought. Alara and Kai had rested through the night, the woman still weak but more alert. Kai, however, hadn't stirred. He lay unconscious, his breathing shallow. Jace had checked on him earlier, but the man's condition hadn't improved. The injuries he had sustained were severe, and there was only so much Jace could do with the limited supplies he had. Jace's mind was busy, turning over the story Alara had told him. The more he thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. A weapon buried beneath the surface? Ancient and powerful? He'd heard rumors before about things hidden on distant planets, lost technologies, secret weapons, but they had always been just that, rumors. Nothing more, but the fear in Alara's voice had been real. She wasn't lying. Jace had lived alone for a reason. He had made it this far by trusting no one, by keeping to himself. But now, here he was, caught up in something far bigger than he had ever imagined. He wasn't sure what the weapon was, but the raiders would stop at nothing to get their hands on it. That much was clear. He didn't like it. He didn't like being involved in things he couldn't control, but there was no going back. Alara and Kai were too deep in this to just walk away. And now, he was too. The sun was beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the desert floor. Jace grabbed his pack and slung it over his shoulder. He glanced at the two strangers. They were still asleep, but not for long. He knew the journey to the settlement wouldn't be easy. It wasn't just the harsh conditions of the desert that made it dangerous. It was the raiders. They could be anywhere, and Jace wasn't about to let his guard down. He bent down beside Kai, checking his pulse. It was weak, but steady. Kai would make it, at least for now. Jace wasn't sure how long the man would last, but he had to try to get them both to safety. Alara stirred beside him, her eyes blinking open. She looked up at Jace, a mixture of gratitude and worry in her eyes. She must have known they were on the move. "Are we leaving?" she asked, her voice hoarse from the dry air. Jace nodded. "We've got to make it to the settlement." "We can't stay here." Alara sat up slowly, wincing as she moved. "Kai, he's not going to make it, is he?" There was no pity in her voice, just a quiet acceptance. Jace didn't know how to answer. He wasn't a healer, and his skills were limited to survival, but he wouldn't lie to her. "He's alive," Jace said finally. "We'll get him help." She reached out and gently touched his hand, her fingers trembling. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "You didn't have to help us. You could have left us to die." He didn't do things for thanks, but there was something in her eyes, something that made him wonder if helping them had been the right choice. They were strangers, but somehow they had become his responsibility. He wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but it was the truth. "We need to keep moving," Jace said, pushing the thoughts from his mind. He couldn't afford to dwell on anything. The desert was unforgiving, and they had no time to waste. Alara nodded, standing with some difficulty. She was weak, but she managed to gather her things. They couldn't afford to stay longer than necessary. Jace glanced at the horizon again, where the settlement waited. They had a long way to go, and the desert was no place for the unprepared. With one last look at the camp, Jace led the way, Alara and Kai following behind. The journey was slow, and every step felt heavier than the last. The heat of the sun began to bear down on them, but they kept moving. There was no other choice. As the hours passed, Jace couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every rustle in the wind, every shadow in the distance made him tense. It wasn't just paranoia. He had lived long enough in the desert to know that when something felt off, it usually was. The wind kicked up, sending dust flying into their faces. Jace squinted against the sting, trying to keep his bearings. The settlement was still a few hours away, but they were close enough to see the faint outlines of buildings in the distance. He could feel the tension in the air. They weren't alone. "Alara," Jace said, his voice low. "Stay close." "We're almost there, but we need to stay alert." She nodded, her face grim. She wasn't stupid. She knew what he meant. The raiders weren't far behind. They continued walking, the heat beginning to take its toll. Jace could feel his throat dry and his strength waning, but he kept pushing forward. He had to get them to the settlement. There, they might find some kind of safety. It was a slim chance, but it was the only one they had. Kai's breathing grew more labored as they walked, and Jace could see the man was struggling to stay conscious. His injuries were severe, and the journey was taking its toll. Alara kept glancing at him, worry clouding her expression. "He needs help," she said, her voice tight with fear. "We can't keep going like this." Jace looked ahead, his jaw clenched. He knew they couldn't stop. Not yet. But he also knew they couldn't make it much farther like this. "We'll find help," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. The settlement was their only hope. Just then, Jace heard a noise behind them. A faint sound carried on the wind. It was almost too soft to hear, but it was enough to make his blood run cold. The sound of footsteps. Jace's hand went to his rifle, his instincts kicking in. He turned, scanning the desert behind them. There was nothing, just sand and dust. But Jace knew that wasn't the end of it. They were being followed, and the raiders were getting closer. The wind picked up again, howling across the desert, carrying with it the scent of dust and danger. Jace's heart pounded in his chest as he kept his eyes on the horizon, the faint outline of the settlement just within reach. But it felt farther away than it had ever been. The footsteps behind them grew louder, the sound unmistakable now. Someone, or something, was following them. Jace could feel the tension in the air, heavy and thick. He slowed his pace, glancing over his shoulder once more. Alara was a few steps behind him, her face drawn with exhaustion. She looked like she was about to collapse, but there was determination in her eyes. She wouldn't stop. Not now. Kai was barely moving at all. His breaths were shallow, his body limp as Alara tried to keep him upright. Jace wanted to help her, but there was no time. The raiders were getting closer, and they had to keep moving. "They're coming," Jace muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. The raiders were close. He could feel it in his bones. Alara glanced up at him, her face pale but steady. "We have to make it. We can't stop now." He had no words for this. He was a cowboy. A loner. A man who had spent his life running from trouble, not running into it. But now it wasn't just about him. It was about them. Alara, Kai, and whatever the raiders were hunting. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. They had made it this far. The settlement was so close. But close wasn't enough. He knew they wouldn't make it without a fight. "We're going to have to stand our ground," Jace said quietly, looking at Alara. Her eyes widened in surprise. "You're not serious. We can't fight them." He didn't like it any more than she did, but they had no choice. "They're not just going to let us walk into that settlement. And Kai's in no condition to run anymore. We stand and fight, or we die here." Alara's face shifted from fear to determination. She nodded slowly, the reality of the situation sinking in. They had no choice. She didn't want to fight, but if they didn't, they would never make it to the settlement. She took a deep breath and moved closer to Jace, ready to face whatever came next. They were almost there. The settlement's buildings were now clearer in the distance. Jace could see the lights flickering on in some of the windows, the first sign of life in the dead of night. They were so close to safety, but it seemed farther than ever. Jace turned to Alara. "Keep moving. I'll hold them off as long as I can." She opened her mouth to protest, but Jace held up a hand. "I'm not asking you to stay behind. I'm just telling you that we won't make it without a fight. We're not just running anymore." Alara hesitated, but then she nodded. "I understand." They pushed forward, Kai's weight heavy between them. Jace's mind raced. He had fought in the past, but this wasn't like any fight he had faced before. This wasn't just about survival. It was about the lives of the people standing beside him. The footsteps behind them grew louder, and Jace's hand tightened around the grip of his rifle. He didn't know how many raiders were following them, but he knew they wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. He had to buy them enough time to reach the settlement. Suddenly, a shadow appeared in the distance, just beyond the flickering light of the settlement. Jace's heart skipped a beat. The raiders had arrived. They were here. A figure stepped into view, tall and menacing. It was a man, his face hidden beneath a dark hood. His posture was casual, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon. Jace's hand tightened around his rifle. He stepped in front of Alara and Kai, preparing for what was to come. "Stay behind me," he said in a low voice. Alara and Kai didn't need to be told twice. They stayed close, watching as the man took another step forward. "Stop right there," Jace called out, his voice steady but firm. "I don't want any trouble." He simply stood there, studying Jace with a cold gaze. Then, after a moment, he spoke. His voice was low, like gravel scraping against stone. "You're not going anywhere," the raider said. "Not without giving us what we came for." Jace's grip on his rifle tightened, but he didn't raise it. Not yet. He couldn't risk making the first move. He needed to know how many more were out there. "I don't have what you're looking for," Jace said, his voice steady, "but I'll make you a deal. You leave, and we don't have to do this." The raider's lips curled into a half smile. "You think you're in a position to make deals?" Jace didn't answer. Instead, he took a step forward, his boots scraping against the dirt. The raider's eyes flickered toward his rifle, and Jace knew he was sizing up the situation. He wasn't going to get any help from the settlement, not unless things got ugly. But if they fought, it would be a massacre. The raider stepped closer. "I don't care about your deal. All I care about is getting what's mine." Jace could see it now. The raider wasn't alone. More shadows appeared behind him, their figures moving swiftly toward them. At least 5 more raiders emerged from the darkness, each one carrying weapons and dressed in the same dark, foreboding attire. Jace's mind raced. They were outnumbered. There was no way they could win this fight, but he couldn't let them take Alara, Kai, or whatever it was they were after. He had to buy them time. "Go," Jace shouted at Alara. "Run for the settlement. Now." Before she could protest, he turned and raised his rifle, firing a shot into the air. The raiders reacted immediately, pulling their weapons and taking cover behind rocks and trees. But it was too late. The fight had already started. Jace fired again, narrowly missing the raider closest to him. The man ducked behind a rock, shouting orders to his group. Jace fired again, this time hitting a raider's arm. The man yelled in pain, dropping to the ground. The others didn't hesitate. They opened fire, the sound of gunshots ringing through the desert. Jace kept moving, dodging behind rocks and firing as fast as he could. His heart pounded in his chest and the adrenaline surged through him. He had fought before, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival. This was about protecting the people he had led into his life, people he had never asked for but now couldn't turn away. "Go!" Jace shouted again, though he wasn't sure if Alara was still listening. The raiders were closing in, the sound of their footsteps, the crack of their weapons. Jace knew they didn't have much time. He had to make it count. With one last shot, Jace took down another raider, but it was clear they were outmatched. The odds weren't in their favor. They needed help, and they needed it now.